time is, as always, quite short, and we have a very packed afternoon agenda. So our first panel this afternoon, continuing some of the themes that were touched upon this morning, our first panel is looking at the topic of finding common cause, a conversation on the intersecting issues on the right to family life for the disability and LGBTI communities. So we have two panelists. Our first is Ellen Murray from Transgender Northern Ireland, Transgender NI. Ellen is the Executive Director of Transgender NI, which is a strategic human rights organization. She's a human rights activist focusing on disability and LGBTQ rights issues. She's also a public appointment to the UK Government Equalities Office LGBT Advisory Panel and focuses on strategic accessibility improvement work, particularly in UK, Ireland and across Europe. Our second panelist, unfortunately, Ian Southey Swartz was unable to attend. So our second panelist, we're very grateful to Sylvia Quan, who was with us this morning and who is joining us again this afternoon to contribute to the panel discussion. So thank you very much to Sylvia. So we'll kick off. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Siobhan. So I'm going to get straight into the questions again as usual. So you, of course, have access to the full bios of our speakers in the program, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how you got involved in your work. But I'd like to start talking about an example. If you could think of an example where these two communities that we're talking about, the disability movement and the LGBTQI movement, have joined together to campaign collectively for rights that affect everyone. So that might include fights for equal marriage, fights for sexual and reproductive rights, anti-discrimination work more generally. I might start with you, Sylvia, if you can think of an example of a campaign where these movements came together.
Thank you again. And well, I have to share with you a convening that was that took place last year in November in Kenya. A convening organized by CREA. The CREA is an organization working on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and this convening was about to explore this intersectionality between disability and LGBTIQ rights regarding sexual and reproductive rights, but also to touch on abortion rights. It was quite I would say a very interesting convening. It was not too many people involved in this convening, because the idea was to come up with some key ideas to launch a campaign. I mean, there have been campaigns going on in the US, some countries in Europe, even in Latin America and Africa. But there doesn't seem to be like a mainstream or a broader movement towards campaigning for intersectionality rights between disability and LGBTI rights. So I think that this was quite interesting. It touched many topics that are considered still taboo in societies. Especially those very conservative societies where LGBTI is still not even spoken about, because in some countries even it is prohibited. So I think that it was quite a good experience to share challenges faced between these two movements, and some common points where we can actually work together. Sorry, next.
I think an example that I would have would be from the island of Ireland, actually. Abortion and fertility rights campaigning on the island has been getting more and more, I suppose, competent in LGBTI issues for a number of years now. I'm from Northern Ireland, where abortion comes with a life prison sentence, and so the context in which people work sort of forces them to be more communicative with other minority groups to get the sort of support that they need in civil society. Something that disability, speak up? Okay. Something that is bringing disability activists and LGBTI activists together on the island of Ireland at the moment is the depathologization of healthcare for trans people, which connects into the larger psychiatric rights movement and disability rights movement generally, where transgender people are no longer under World Health Organization provisos required to have a mental health or behavioural diagnosis to access healthcare. However, in the UK and Ireland, we see people being subjected to, in some cases, what amounts to psychological torture to access care. And we're finding that some of the challenges within that are that mainstream LGBT organisations default to, well, we're not disabled, so why are we having to go through this process? And that, of course, throws disabled people under the bus. So it's been quite useful, although frustrating, to have to keep iterating it and keep focusing on it constantly to make sure that the language around depathologization and making healthcare more accessible in bodily choice and bodily integrity, to make that competent in disability issues without validating the human rights abuses that are happening or putting down other disabled people while we do it.
So yeah, you've just raised the issue there of bodily autonomy, which is really crucial, I think, for the activism of both the disability community and the LGBTI movement. As you've mentioned, so queer people and disabled people have both experienced different kinds of medical interventions without their consent. We heard this morning already about forced sterilisation, the kinds of corrective surgeries that were imposed on young intersex people, for example, and the kinds of forced psychiatric treatment that we'll be talking about during the week. But at the same time then, the care, the medical services that people are actively seeking are sometimes refused because these are not believed to be best for people. So what do you think we need to change collectively in both of these movements to make there be greater respect and recognition for people's identities as they are, as part of just the diversity of humanity without imposing medical intervention against people's will? Sylvia?
Thank you. I think that Ellen mentioned something very important, and it's how disability movement is still very prejudiced against LGBTIQ people, and vice versa. I think that there's still this very big barrier that doesn't allow both movements to come together and struggle for their rights. I've heard phrases such as, but belonging to sexual diversity doesn't make that person a disabled person. That is not a disability. And I've heard things such as, disability is more related to an impairment, while sexual diversity is a matter of choice. So we cannot really link both things together. I mean, phrases like these are very commonly heard, even coming from people who call themselves human rights experts. So I think that stigma, discrimination is still the major barrier to coming, to having both movements coming closer and finding commonalities, even though there are existing there. So pathologization of both having a disability, but also of being LGBTIQ, thinking that it does need some kind of medical treatment, being forced or not, is something common between both movements. But there are still many barriers that impede us to see this as a common a common situation to struggle for. And this is just one example.
Yeah, I think it's worth acknowledging how central anti-disability or ableist discrimination is to a lot of the issues that LGBTI people experience within. Is this better? Cool. I think it's worth acknowledging how central anti-disability biases towards in the sort of barriers and discrimination that LGBTI people experience within healthcare services specifically. For example, the forced interventions and surgeries that intersex infants often experience all around the world, including here in Ireland, is often based in the rejection of atypical human bodies, which is connected absolutely to an enforcement of a binary of sex and gender, but also of an enforcement of typical biology and typical anatomy, which is connected to disability. Something that we're seeing at the moment across Europe, lots of other parts of the world are better at this than Europe, but we're seeing now disabled people being used as an excuse almost to hold back access to health interventions, for example, for transgender young people and young adults, where it's because they have a disability or are perceived to have a disability, and therefore they are at risk of being recruited by the militant queers. Like these are some arguments that are legitimately used and turn up in my Twitter inbox quite regularly. Making consent, like actual meaningful consent, central to all of this does improve things. Like when we see trans healthcare services and fertility treatment that's good for lesbian and bisexual women, for example. And sexual health services is another good example where there's a lot of history of doing things right. Talking about consent in meaningful ways that don't assume a willingness to comply to existing stereotypes or categories is a very, very useful practice to get into. But unfortunately, the pathology against disabled people and against LGBTI people as devious or deviant or innate harms to children or families or to women enforces that pathologization in the law and in practice here and around the world.
So we know that disabled people can often feel marginalised in queer spaces. This month is Pride, and we've heard a lot about inaccessible Pride marches, inaccessible Pride events. And of course, queer people have often felt excluded from the disability movement, as we've been just saying, particularly where it might be felt that for a long time the most prominent voices were straight and cis, as well as white and middle class. So how do you think we can make both of these movements and all of these spaces more inclusive for everybody? Sylvia?
I think the key to inclusion, of course, is accepting diversity. And I even feel that even if we're talking that the disability rights movement is inclusion is one of its main principles, it is still excluding some people. And I would say that maybe LGBTI is the most excluded group from the mainstream disability rights movement. And I think that we have to really empower ourselves with these principles. We talk so much about the CRPD and its principles, and we're not putting them into practice. I mean, we can talk a lot about CRPD and how it is being not complied with, but we ourselves as persons with disabilities are not putting into practice the principles of the CRPD, and diversity is one of them. But then we are unable to see the intersectionality also between these diverse groups. We can only see within ourselves, but we're so good to exclude other groups and not see how many common points we have, and it would certainly make us stronger. I think it is a strong message for us as disability rights movement, and I would think also for the LGBTI. I think that the same challenges are faced by them too.
I think what Sylvia said's absolutely right. In terms of LGBTI spaces being inaccessible, the vast majority of LGBTI community spaces, both on this island and around the world, are inaccessible to various degrees. I think addressing that requires those organisations and community groups accepting that LGBT people are worth including in their spaces, in our spaces, I should say, because a lot of people honestly don't. It's very much an afterthought. What can be useful is showing how good things can be when there is disability access. So where good practice exists, we have a trans centre up in Belfast, which is step-free and is accessible in other ways. And now the majority of volunteers are disabled. So that work keeps going and is now sustainable because of those simple changes. I think what's really, really important to challenge as well is challenging the sexualization of LGBTI people in popular media. Because when we are perceived as risks to disabled people or to children, that means people who have less control over to where or how they access spaces, whether that's relying on carers or family to get to places, or as young people who are perceived not to have capacity to consent, that scares those people away. And the disabled LGBTI people still want and need access to those spaces, but it's perceived not in their best interest to do so because it'll influence them in some way or another. Ultimately, this comes back down to LGBTI as dangerous as perversion, and ultimately that historically comes back to how psychosocial disability has been treated throughout the ages. So all of this boils down to anti-disability stuff in a lot of ways, and I found it very useful when talking to mainstream LGBTI activists working internationally to teach them their history. LGBTI history didn't start in the 50s or 40s or 30s. It goes a long way behind, and forced treatment, institutionalization, and forced sterilization is historic, but also contemporary practice around Europe today for LGBTI people, and that's been a really useful tool, sort of just opening their eyes to require them to acknowledge it.
We have a few minutes to open the floor to questions, but to save time, we might take 2 or 3 questions together if we can.
We can continue the conversations. We have a question here right away at the back. We can get a mic up there. And we can take 2 or 3 questions together. So is there anybody else? Yeah.